Okay, welcome. So, continuing along from the last video about greed ideology, I'm going to dive into racism specifically here because there's a lot of work being done right now with a couple of concepts very specifically around racism. Here we are in our map of the overall pedagogy that we're going to be talking about. We're still very much in the first major category there, looking at issues of thriving. Obviously, we're talking about racism, so social sustainability. So there's been a lot of work, and I'm not going to repeat it, but there's been a lot of work on implicit bias and microaggressions. And the only thing I'm really going to do here is take a look at it through the lens of ideology of greed, just as another angle to see it. And I think it's an important one because oftentimes when we do this kind of work, understanding implicit bias and trying to look at the behaviors that are manifested in terms of microaggressions, when we do that kind of work, oftentimes I think what's missing is the larger discussion about where it's all coming from. And that's, I think, true for really most categories of social injustices. We really focus and do really good work on the category itself, but I think we're, again, sort of missing another layer, another frame of reference. Okay, so I've provided only a few resources here, just in case you want to do a little bit more work with that. I'm sure you've seen a lot of this stuff already, but just in case. So here's just one version of a pyramid looking at overt and covert white supremacy. And within that, you would see, especially in the covert, you see a lot of microaggressions sort of coming out of that. And the microaggressions are, I'm going to let other people explain it if you need that background. So what I've done here is to say that we have a great video here that I think is, a good summary of implicit bias. And we have another one that focuses on microaggressions. Feel free to go through them as you will. Just switch over to the slideshow, click on them, and you can take the time if that's something that you like to do. They're good, they're short. I think they do a really good job of the two issues. The larger picture here is that implicit bias is something that is feelings and thoughts that are below the surface, kind of programmed and conditioned into people, and those under the surface conditions will manifest themselves in things that we say, and they have sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle meanings of making people not feel that they belong, that they feel like they're invalidated. They can certainly be insulted. They can certainly be assaulted. So those are the three versions of microaggressions there. In any case, the video does a much better job. I'm just going to move along. So just, hit stop, go over to the slideshow, and take a look at those. All right, so I'm going to move along and go into a different kind of analysis with this. So racism as a tool for greed is where I'm going with this. And this is a very messy flowchart. Okay, so it's a flowchart that's intended to look at racism a bit differently because it's using greed and greed ideology as the base. Now, at first glance, obviously you see the three different colors, and I'll give you a little bit more of an orientation here. There's an outer ring, that's a red ring, and then there's two inner circles, if you want to call it that, and they're not overlapping. There's a green circle and another circle within a circle, and almost a circle. I know, I'm already making this complicated. And then there's the blue one, which is its own sort of circle, right? And you can see the green and the blue are not overlapping. All right, where do we start, right? There's a reason why racism is hard to understand. There's many layers to it, and sifting through the layers and trying to see how they all operate is it's a lot, and it's a lot of work, and it means that there has to be a lot of clarity to sort of get where this is coming from. And I'm going to complicate it a little bit more by using the lens of analysis through an ideology of greed to see how racism might be operating with greed as the driver. Okay, you ready for this? So, I've talked about this before. I talked about this in the last video on greed ideology. Instead of thinking of a starting place at the point of racism, if we start with greed as the point of understanding this desire to chase money, increase wealth, and so forth, right? It's something that we've been doing on this planet for quite some time, and we very much have rationalized and moralized and normalized greed in our lives. This is, if you were an alien from another planet and you came down here, you'd be like, whoa, that one species there, they are a super greedy bunch. And then you'd be smart enough to take off, maybe get some, trinkets along the way to give to the kids, and take off, leave, don't come back. All right, we are a people that follow greed and have been doing so for centuries. We sort of range in our greediness from smaller levels to very, very intense levels. Now, it seems unfair, right? We're like, well, are we all participating in this? Yes, we are all participating in this, okay? There is an underlying implicit bias that's not just racism. There's an underlying implicit bias towards getting wealthy. That is a big one. And that is running our lives. We attach everything to that chase, right? So I'm going to talk through that a bit more. And again, you've heard me say that in other videos as well. So where am I starting? I'm starting at the very top there, the highest rectangle, which says greed of wealthy executive class. Now, there's a reason why I'm picking that class first, right? You might say, well, wait a second, I thought this is on racism. Why class? Let me make a statement right now. Racism is classism. It's really important to understand because the larger system that we're living in is chasing money. So people will oftentimes have this argument. Is it classism? Is it racism? Is it whatever? They are tied together because of what I'm about to explain. Let me do the explanation, and then if I remember, I'll come back around to this ongoing feud. Is it racism? Is it classism? Okay. I'm going to say that it's greed that's driving the show, which is not exactly the same as class. But, that being said, the first stop here along the train, along this very convoluted, train, is greed of wealthy executive class. So, this is something that has existed, again, for centuries. Whether you want to call it the ruling parties, the royalty, whoever. This is something that has been around for really quite some time. Humans, like I say, normalized, rationalized, moralized greed. It's okay to be greedy. In fact, you're supposed to be greedy and on this planet, right? Now, there are societies on the planet that have said, no, this is not okay. This is actually really destructive. That society is not in the United States of America. They are in other parts of the planet. And see the United States as a space that just keeps putting greed, forward as the most important thing. That's what success is. That's what social justice is, and so forth. Okay, so I'm starting there. The arrow goes down to the left to the next box that says, create race as a tool to outcompete others for wealth supremacy. Race, as a concept, is just, it's an idea where someone says, I'm within a group, and here's the parameters for this group. You're in another group, and you have different parameters and descriptors for that group. The purpose for that separation, for recognizing that difference, is none other than for me to exploit you, for my group to exploit your group. Okay? Whether it's through colonization, whether it's through wealth concentration, whether it's through power. Colonization and power all lead to wealth. So a lot of this all points back to wealth. So when you see this sort of in history, and I know there's plenty of people who will look at this and say that's not how it happened, blah blah blah. Look at the frames that you're using to analyze history. Apply the greed frame, and keep seeing if you keep investigating, and see if you don't see that popping up more and more and more, right? Religions have played into greed, right? Everything that we can sort of name in history that's part of Western civilization, especially, has been driven by greed. Not exclusively Western civilization, Western civilizations, Western cultures. It's not exclusively, but it certainly is something that is the primary driver for Western culture. So when you look at this way of sort of dominating each other is by saying, basically, my desire is to dominate you and to make sure that I get the wealth and power and you don't. And to do that, I have to create a list of things that makes you different from me. And then I can apply that across other people that are more similar, in my view, to you than they are me. And then that becomes a larger argument for dominating you and your group, the group that I've sort of now determined that you're part of, so that I can push you out of the way, get my wealth, exploit you, so that whether it's pushing you out of the way, that's a form of exploitation, using you directly to generate wealth for me, right? We see that in all kinds of different ways, but largely capitalism does that. Feudalism certainly did that too. These are just methods for driving greed, okay? But you have to create this idea that there is another group, and the word race is just a placeholder for a group. That's all it is. Now, I'll say this. Race is not real. Racism is very real, right? There are no races. There's not a single race on the planet. We have species, but there's not race. Now, on the other side of that is there absolutely is race. Not biologically, but because of the way in which the dominant group has historically kept pushing this button. There's race, there's race, there's race, there's race. Now we have to sort of live by that very fake imagined state of categorizing each other. And we now have a history that has played into that we're either ignoring, denying, trying to push back against, whatever, right? Race is not real. It's a completely fabricated construct, but it was used with the intention to exploit. So that's what makes it now real, right? The idea is real because we've had to live by it, and the racism is absolutely real because we've had to live by it, right? So race, completely fabricated, completely made up thing, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the impact of it has been so detrimental. Okay? Now, similarly, money is completely made up too. So now we're talking about two very impactful ideas that have plagued humanity for, how long now? I don't even know how. So we're, thousands of years into these kinds of practices, both of which are completely made up. Race creation is used to push people away or to exploit them, basically so that I can have power, prestige, money, and so forth. The creation of race is completely fake, but it's always from a very, malintent kind of place, right? Does that mean that people don't then identify with it. No, if you're being if it's being thrusted onto you, then you, on some level, have to identify with it. I think future humanity will realize how much uh, of this is just garbage treatment of each other, and future humanity, being optimistic here, will say, no, 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 no. This is not a thing that we're ever going to do again, and we're going to monitor to make sure that we don't do this again. But we're not there. Right now, we're very stuck in a greed ideology which mandates that we keep pushing the race button over and over and over so that exploitation and profit can keep happening. So, step one here is creating the idea of race as a tool so you can outcompete and really exploit, okay, for the purpose of wealth. The next red box down from that, enforce race supremacy thinking rather than wealth supremacy thinking. So enforce race supremacy thinking rather than wealth supremacy thinking. What that means is if you confuse people enough and create lots of dialogue around why that group of people is a threat to you, as opposed to keeping it tied directly to money. So anybody can go for money, right? But if it's easier, not these are not things I feel good about talking about. It's easier to sort of categorize a people and call them as a group a threat, and then they're after you, right? They're coming after you. Harder to do when you're talking about wealth because money is something that's sort of pervasive within society. You can't really you can't take a dollar bill and attach it directly to a group of people. Now, I sort of say that knowing full well that obviously we know who the wealthy, super wealthy people are on the planet, and they tend to be, folks who are mostly white or very much play along with whiteness, for the most part, right? Okay. So enforcing sort of a race supremacy thinking rather than a wealth supremacy thinking. If we were thinking about wealth supremacy, that's you go after the groups who are now exploiting so that they can have more money, and we would just sort of see it as wrong. Race supremacy is one step removed, and it keeps us from really engaging in the wealth conversation in a more direct way. So that's why you enforce a race supremacy thinking rather than a wealth supremacy thinking. But the goal here is wealth supremacy, not race supremacy. Race supremacy is a trick. It's about distracting people so you can, one, exploit groups, and two, keep them distracted so that they think that there's something else that's going on that they have to pay attention to rather than the thing that's actually screwing them over. Right? Okay. So out of the enforcement of a race supremacy thinking become basically two races. You either fall into the exploiter race or the exploited race or group of races. If you start to split up the exploited races, then you can get them to target each other, which happens a lot, right? All of that targeting of each other with the exploited groups means that they're not going after the exploiter. That's creating the whole problem to begin with, right? Or maintaining a structure that keeps that happening. So if we keep following the red arrow to the red box, we'll do that first, right? Exploitation, you see that in quotes and italicized there. Exploitation is freedom, opportunity, and justice. That's what we have to live by. We have to live by this idea that exploitation is what we have to keep chasing because it leads to wealth. So you have this awful paradox, right? exploitation, not a good thing, but yet we have to engage in it so that we can have freedom, opportunity, and justice. So be a capitalist, right? Do your homework, go to school, get the higher paying job. That's social justice, that's freedom, that's opportunity. But you see how it's sort of reframed in not the word exploitation anymore, but in terms of opportunity, freedom, justice, social justice, right? So that's a trick, and that's an important sleight of hand that needs to be confronted, right? Exploitation is freedom, opportunity, and justice. It's not something that we can keep living by. Now, if you look at that particular rectangle, you have two arrows on the top of it that split out, right? They go to the exploited races, and it goes to the exploited races, which I'll get to in a second. So just keep an eye on those arrows. We'll come back to it, right? Let's keep following it around. So from that bottom red box to the next red box, exploit all other races for profit, something I've been talking about here, right? So the exploiter race has a discourse that we all follow, and it's sort of turned on its head so that we can feel good about it. And now, because of that, they're able to exploit all other races, which I put in quotes because, again, races don't really exist, but all other races, right? This is something that we see all the time, the sort of othering, this you're not me, and you're in this other category, so, the exploitation is now aimed at these groups, which produces the wealth supremacy and sort of reinforces the system itself, the structure itself, so that the greed of the wealthy executive class is still maintained, and the system's working in their favor. So there's most of the red, right? Let's go down to the enforce race supremacy thinking. There's that red arrow that splits off to the blue. So now we have two, like I said before, the exploiter group and the exploited group. Now, if we're still thinking about this in terms of color, right, it's because people have been identified as potential exploitable workers, and it was by no mistake or coincidence that the Europeans who started to really employ this at these massive levels were targeting it, and we continue to target in terms of sort of globalization 1.0, which was globalization / slavery, and then globalization / globalization 2.0, which is what we're doing today, which is very, very low wage workers who are also people of color. What a shock that we're continuing to do this practice and to really exploit people of color around the planet for these large companies and all of that. So here we are at this blue box, exploited races. Now, there's a green arrow that goes up and a blue arrow that goes off to the side. Let me sort of do the blue arrow here. The blue is going to focus on people of color. So we've been using the phrase or the abbreviation BIPOC lately, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And it, again, these are terms that will probably change. There might be, I'm sure there's folks who don't like this usage, and I certainly understand. We're always in this sort of pocket of trying to find the best ways to identify targeted groups, right? So anyway, I'm going with this for now. If you have a different one that you prefer, absolutely fine. Just looking for something I can use at this point, right? Okay, so exploited races. What does that mean? Well, if you go over to the first bottom green box, you see exploited, exploiter, subrace. So the green one is really talking about poor, and I'll just say it's really more like exploited white. They're exploited. They think they're in the exploiter race, the dominant group. They won't use the word exploiter, right? But they think they're in the dominant group. So they're exploited, exploiter, right? As opposed to exploited. I know it's a silly sort of thing here. What am I doing? What we oftentimes refer to as sort of people of color, um, and of course this plays out with women too. This is not something that's just race, but right now I'm talking about race specifically. Okay, so this group here is exploited. They're treated as the, the employee. They're treated as a slave. They're treated as uh, you know like, hey, you should love this. Why are you not? This is good. This is good for you. This is opportunity for you, right? You see those red arrows going up to there too, saying the same thing, right? This is good for you, right? You got to feed them that medicine, that mental medicine, so you stay on board and adhere to the exploitation that I need you to, so that you can become, this sort of docile worker who makes me, the wealthy exploiter race, uh, wealthy, right? Like wealthier. It's really a hard pill to swallow. Um, but there's a lot of that going on. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, billionaires don't talk like that, right? Billionaires are not doing that. You're making this up. You're getting into some sort of like victim mentality and all that. Look, exploitation is the name of the game, right? I'm you know, Walmart's a specific example of this. Walmart relies heavily on multi forms of exploitation. Pay them as little as possible, get products into the store where other workers were paid as little as possible. Uh, you know, if we can get away with paying our workers less, we will, so that we can become wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. That's the name of the game, right? Now you might say, well, what about other companies where there's you know higher skilled workers? There's your rationalization, right? That's the rationalization that we oftentimes struggle with. So what about that? Higher skilled workers, and they get paid more. They get paid, you know, whatever, $80,000, $90,000, $120,000 a year. And again, I've talked about that in the last one. If we keep going back to that rationalization, and which is also normalizing and also moralizing, we're going to keep getting caught in that trap, right? The idea here is that the bottom 90% are exploited by the top 10%. That's what we're really looking at in terms of how things work in this country, right? And as teachers and administrators and parents, we're often trying to tell our kids, it's good for you. Essentially, become a higher level exploited worker, right? That's social justice, and that's really the best opportunity you're going to get anyway, right? So we're really stuck with that, and it's hard to do things like make communities healthier when we have that kind of thing stuck in our head. Okay, so exploited races. There's that. They're forced into poverty because they're even more targeted in terms of the level of exploitation that's put on them. So they're not just in debt, they're also in poverty, right? It happens to be much more so. Poverty is attached to color, right? People of color, especially in this country, but around the world too, but especially in this country. So you're going to see a little bit of a difference when I get over to the green. Okay, the focus here is about exploiting to the nth degree as much as possible. Do some people of color get out of this? I mean, it's statistically insignificant, right? It's not even, if you're gonna tokenize like that, this is not a conversation that we can have, right? Okay. So forced into poverty or debt, but most likely poverty. If you look at the numbers are supportive of that. Then that is what keeps them part of the exploited groups, right? So you're exploited in the work, you're exploited in the labor, you're exploited in the bills that you have to pay and the life that you have to live, and then you're driven back into poverty, right? Or never let out of it. And so that cycle keeps you there. That's sort of the blue cycle. Okay? Now, how does that explain implicit bias or microaggressions or anything like that? It doesn't. not directly. So let me go to the green, right? So in the green, there's this other group that we oftentimes don't talk too much about but needs attention because it's having a great effect on our society. In fact, I would argue to some extent that this is the accomplice group. Getting severely screwed over, but still participate in it willingly, oftentimes, right? So you see the word poor there, and I know that sort of triggers a certain kind of understanding, but what I'm really talking about here is just being exploited. So we have very, very poor white people, and but we also have people who are working 70, 80 hours a week for, yes, $100,000 or more. So they're not poor in the financial sense, but they're certainly exploited and are giving their lives over, and they're poor in other ways, right? Their quality of life is poor. Their relationships are poor. They're neglectful to their kids. And what are they trying to do? The best thing that they can do is sort of fight for them to be, at this socioeconomic status as adults. So there's a lot of other poverties going on here that are not just money. Although money, as we know, has just an impact on all aspects of life, right? Especially when somebody is fighting against poverty. Absolutely. Okay. So understood. Absolutely understood. Okay. But I am using various kinds of poor here. Um, so when you are poor, there's a lot of threats against you. Now, if you look at the intersection of actual money poor and being white, if you look at those two, sort of, it's the intersection of those two, there's a lot of anger that comes out of that. Why? Because you're white. This is not something that you should be experiencing, right? You're part of the exploiter group. How is it that you're, experiencing this because you're supposedly in the dominant group? So there's a lot of anger there, and there's also more anger, sort of doubled up when people who are experiencing this feel like they're not being heard. So that happens, right? And if the anger is so much, it becomes fundamentalist and extremist, and that's where you get the KKKs, and that's where you get the, QAnons, and you get all of the very deliberate, hardcore, extremist thinking that is now turning into hatred towards people of color, and in very overt sort of ways, right? So the way in which that slice of white is treated is very financially insecure, just as insecure, by the way, of people of color, right? Are experiencing the difference there being the dominant group is now having this sort of split in their thinking, and it becomes an extremist, very poorly informed anger directed at people who they think is the threat, who are not the people that are the threat. Not even close, right? But that being forced into debt, right, which is more often the case for white people, but also there is poverty, right? There's very much poor people who are experiencing poverty too, not just debt, right? Debt and poverty are two different things. They're not exactly the same thing. So debt is the reason why I'm bringing that up as different here compared to the blue, is because the emphasis tends to be more on debt for white people than poverty, which is not to say that white people don't also experience poverty, because they do. When white people do experience poverty, that anger creates that sort of mental split of, I'm supposed to be making it because I'm in this group, so I feel either like I'm an utter failure, which creates depression and anger, or I feel, anybody else who I perceive is trying to compete with me, I hate them because they're now a direct threat to me. And then you get that kind of, just terribleness that we see over and over and over. The very overt kind of stuff, right? The sort of top of the pyramid of white supremacy kind of stuff, right? So that's that portion, that sort of inner circle there, right? The inner loop there. So exploiter, insecure financially, moves over to hatred, right? It creates a sort of hatred. It's a misplaced hatred, but a hatred nonetheless. Um, and then that, in and of itself, now fuels back to enforcing a race supremacy thinking, right? Goes right back into the cycle and keeps everything in place. Now, there's more subtle versions of this, right? So you have the green, poor or just overly exploited white people who are not, they're white, but that's the only similarity that they have with the exploiter group. They're experiencing debt and or poverty, and the debt is more often the debt group that's doing the implicit bias, because there's this sort of effort to not be racist, but it's all in there. The record is playing inside the head. Whereas the poverty group is, because of the threat levels being higher and more intense, it just comes out, right? And it's enacted, and it tends to be, a working class group that's always 2 steps away from homelessness, right? So this group is not that. The debt group is, you don't have any wealth, but you have a ton of debt that keeps you, stuck in the system. You have no other choice here. So the debt group, the green debt group, tends to be the ones that have a lot more of the implicit bias going on, which is to say it's playing in their head, and it's not something that's expressed in the sort of fundamentalist extremist form of whiteness. What it tends to be is, these 2 sort of competing dialogue or discourses inside somebody's head, right? It's the need to be fair, need to treat everybody fairly, don't be racist, and then there's the all of the horribly informed, ways of thinking that the person has been conditioned to as they've grown up, right? Whether it's home life, media, whatever it is. So now we're stuck at this box of this implicit bias. Implicit bias is the thinking inside of somebody's head, and it tends to be not what somebody really wants to think, but it's there, and it comes out in these ways. And how does it come out? It comes out in the form of microaggressions. And so it's different than the overt hatred, right? If we go back to I'll just go back for a second. This box or pyramid, right? The top. This is what I was saying before. The sort of top of the pyramid stuff is typically poor, white people whose threat levels are super high. So all of their quote unquote implicit biases are not so implicit. They're very explicit, right? They're completely misplaced. It's the people who they think are their threats are not their threats at all, but that's what they're stuck with in their head, right? So there's the overt version, and then there's the covert version, which is where the implicit biases and the microaggressions tend to manifest, right? So the implicit biases are the thinking, and then the ways in which they're enacted are the microaggressions, which also can be very damaging, right? It's not just what we say. It can also be physical. It could be police brutality, for instance, right? Which is not as the we can have a discussion around that, but it's something that doctors do this sort of stuff too, and you see that in the video where 2 people side by side can have the same amount of pain going on with the same amount of injury or condition, and that a white person is going to get more support, more maybe pain medicines or something like that, although that has its own problems, whereas a black person is typically going to, and the patterns that they're going to suffer more, right, because of the implicit bias. It's not like somebody is intending to make that difference, but because they're not attending to what their behind the scenes thinking and differences are, it manifests itself in terms of action. Okay, so the top of the pyramid is more of the hatred, the acts of hatred, and then the underneath that line, the covert section becomes more and more and more of the implicit biases and the microaggressions, right? So let's get back here. We're almost there. Yep, yep. All right. So whether it's the hatred, which is the sort of overt stuff, or the microaggressions, the covert versions, they're both now feeding back into this sort of race supremacy thinking that keeps, um, you know, BIPOC, people of color, out of the, places of power, wealth, and so forth, right? Because that's been the intention ever since. So if greed is a driver, right? Greed is doing a few things all at once, right? Greed is making it so that the top 10% group can keep accumulating wealth, more and more and more and more wealth, right? So it's sort of the red. It's doing another thing, which is that it's created this sort of this second umbrella group, which is now the folks that are going to be exploited, and it's based on race, so we think, right? It is, but race one is a fake construct to begin with, but we have to live by it, so it's not very fake. It's something that we're living by now. And the very group that started this whole thing is very much not interested in having all members of its own group, right? So white people who are at the top are not interested in having all white people succeed. What they're interested in is having all white people perpetuate the cycle. So those white people, the exploited white people, have to get on board with this, or else this doesn't work either, right? So we have these layers, which is really the problem. Well, it's not the problem, it's a problem, because it makes it a little more impenetrable and a little more confusing, right, to understand. So, this is, I don't think this is the entirety of understanding racism at all. I would never, but I think it's another angle in to kind of see of how this is playing out, right? If you're thinking about it in terms of teaching, what we'll see less of is the over poor white person who's now the teacher in the classroom. What we will see more of is the covert white person, especially white person, who's not going the route of hatred, but is going the route of implicit, because they haven't quite addressed whatever was sort of plugged into them as they were growing up. These categories, these the way in which difference is sort of framed. This kind of difference is framed as negative. This kind of difference is framed as this and that. And so we have these patterns now just sort of stuck in our heads. And it sucks. I mean, it just sucks, right? So what do we do with this sort of implicit? Well, we also have to make sure that the way in which we're talking is not engaging with that stuff that's back there. What we really need to do is get rid of what's back there, right? We need to clean house in the back of our head. But in lieu of being able to sort of do that on a regular basis, which we can do, just we at the very least have to pay attention to it. Now, let me just say one more thing here. Can we do that? Yes, absolutely we can. Right? We can get rid of what's in the back of our head. And I think the way that we do that, again, has to do with that third red box there. If we're going to keep enforcing this race supremacy thinking in our head, that it's about race, it's about race, it's about race. It is about race, but what's bigger than that? It's about greed. If you shift into greed and how greed is creating these issues with race, it's much easier to start undoing what's in the back of your head, right? The back of your head thinking, the implicit things that we don't want back there, and makes us, hurt people. In this case, hurt our students. So what we have going on back there requires a perspective shift, which is why I keep bringing up that this is about greed, and it's about wealth concentration, it's about wealth supremacy. It's not about race supremacy, right? But we have to consider the race stuff. I'm not saying, oh, okay, just drop the race thing and move on. No, no, no. What I'm saying is that we have to put it into the framing of wealth supremacy and how wealth supremacy creates race, which is that second box, right? So that's what this is all about here, and I know it's sort of a mangled mess of things, but if you take some time and stop listening to me talk and sort of walk through it again, or rewind and walk through it again, it's a rewiring in our heads of what we think the problems are and how they're working, right? Is racism real? Yes, it absolutely is, very much so. And all I'm saying here is that there's a different starting place and there's a different driver than what we tend to pay attention to. Okay? So, prompts for discussion. What are your initial responses to the session? Take some time to do that as a group. These are all questions that would be worth having some conversations around. But take some time to jot down some ideas, get your thoughts together. Number 2, to what extent does implicit bias need to be confronted in public education? Number 3, to what extent will confronting implicit bias have an impact on students and families of color? Right? And then where might limitations occur if we only confront implicit bias? Again, that's why I put together the whole weird flowchart of the reds and the greens and the blues. Because it's not just about implicit bias. It's not just about racism. Right? It has more to do with what's driving it, which is greed. Right? So where might limitations occur if we only confront implicit bias? Right? It's something that we're doing right now, and we're getting sort of, it's more common. I don't know if it's more comfortable, but it's more common that we're doing this. But if we leave it here, what are those limitations? And number 4, to what extent does confronting a greed ideology seem to confront racism as a whole? Okay. So again, it's just sort of the flip of the second question in number 3. All right, so activity. Discuss thoughts in a whole group setting about how greed ideology is a root of racism overall, and with implicit bias and microaggressions. So how is greed ideology the root of racism? Do you agree with what I've been saying? Do you need more discussion to sort of have that with each other? Because this might be a new concept and it's a complicated one. And then how does greed ideology, how is it running the show with implicit bias and microaggressions? And then number 2 here, in small groups that, modify at will, right? Discuss ways in which any form of racism needs to be confronted in your district, town, city, or school. Focus especially on types of racist practices that can be confronted immediately versus those that might need more time. Return to the whole group setting and discuss, and record answers for all small groups in the electronic document. So there you go. All right. Just a little to get us down the road. Oh, and I just wanted to say this with that part there. Focus on what you can be confronted immediately. It's not to say don't go after things that need more time. I mean, they need more time, which means start working on those too, right? But it's I think a good practice to identify and sort of triage what's going on and what can be taken care of, more immediately. That's a tricky one, right? So anyway, see what you can come up with. All right, so that's it. I hope this was helpful. I know it's somewhat, difficult to look at all the layers like that. So anyway, all right, take care.